What's so alarming is that sufferers can go from being perfectly healthy to critical in a matter of hours. In spite of that, authorities have appealed for people not to panic.
Someone should have told Ray not to panic. Or should that be not to create panic?
Highly contagious and deadly. The terrifying disease threatening families across the country.
Parents' worst nightmare, you don't get any sicker unless you die.
We explain the warning signs and what you need to know to protect your children.
A story no parent can afford to miss. Good evening. It took time, but a couple of newspapers eventually got meningococcus in proportion. As a notifiable disease, Justine Ferrari reported in the Oz, its rate is just 2 cases per 100,000 Australians. Hepatitis C is 90, Ross River fever 43, whooping coughs 22, and tuberculosis occurs at a rate of 6 cases per 100,000 people. The Fairfax Herald ran a graphic showing almost no variation this year from the disease's ordinary seasonal pattern. And Channel 10 was firmly told by an expert,
you know, this is not an emergency, this is not an outbreak. We're seeing roughly about the same order of magnitude of cases that we see every year.
You didn't think those inconvenient facts were going to get in the way of a good story, did you? Of course not.
Contact infection kills WA rower.
Killer bug puts rowers on alert.
Woman tells of virus hell.
It isn't a virus, it's a bacterial infection of the bloodstream.
Baby has arms, legs amputated.
Schools alerted to killer virus.
Well, it is the Telegraph.
Don't share lunch.
Baby fights for life.
Disease scare sparks run on vaccine.
Killer disease strikes again.
Fearful parents flood hospitals.
It'd be unfair to blame newspapers alone for panicking people. Tabloid television was even more hysterical in its scaremongering.
Against a deadly blood disease.
Have been given emergency vaccinations amid fears of a deadly bacteria outbreak.
8-month-old Grace Willis is just the latest to fall victim to meningococcal disease.
Less than 1% of those who contract meningococcal disease will require amputation. More frightening, though, 10% will die.
It's a deadly disease that's claiming more and more victims.
Parents of small children are becoming increasingly terrified.
That's the ABC, enthusiastic tabloidist. Inexplicably, ABC News came up with one set of figures for the incidence of the disease.
There are about 400 cases in Australia each year. For the 9 months to September in 1996, there were 287 cases. This year, 337, an increase of 50 cases.
But 7 News seemed to contradict that.
These are the national figures so far. 359 cases reported this year, 426 last year.
There's nothing like a medical scare. Who could forget the flesh-eating bug? Now, let me look at the West Australian and another instance of the problems implicit in there being only one paper in town. We start with the West's front page a week ago.
Premier Richard Court and his wife Jo have cut themselves off from a controversial Japanese religious cult, which Mrs. Court followed for more than 10 years.
Cult members believe that they can radiate the Creator God's light from their hands.
This light can be used to fix inanimate objects such as cars.
Reporter Leroy Betty wanted to know if the Premier was a believer in radiated light.
Do you want to know what time I have a shower? Next, you will want to ask questions about my private life behind closed doors or whatever.
On the inside pages, Betty exposed it as pretty loony stuff.
A divine pendant.
The one who wears this pendant can channel the light of the Creator God.
On Monday, the West kept it going.
The Australian leader of a controversial cult was claiming only 7 weeks ago that Premier Richard Court's wife, Jo, was a member of the sect.
Mr. Court gave ABC News an interview. Damage control.
My wife and myself are not involved in any religious cult. I find it personally very, very offensive. Material that has been published in the media.
Mr. Court says his wife shouldn't be subjected to questions about her beliefs. Simon Santo, ABC News.
And he followed up on 6PR.
You know, people's religious beliefs are very personal, and when you have a story that tries to paint the impression that you're a mob of cuckoos, yeah, it hurts, but As you know, Jo's a pretty strong person. She's a bright, positive person. That's the exact opposite of what she stands for. And but I suppose the feeling around our house on the weekend was a bit like, as if a burglar had just been through the place.
The West Australian's editor, Paul Murray, wasn't going to let him get away with that.
Well, I think he cries privacy when it's convenient, but when he's in election mode, he invites us to go into church with him and his wife to photograph them in church. Clearly he thinks there's a political spin-off for him there. He uses his wife extensively in door knocking at those times, so he uses her in a political role at that stage.
Murray has a point, but the paper's expose of the court's links with mystical motor mechanics did come just 4 days after the Premier announced a proposal that would cut deeply into the West's classified advertising revenue.
Mr. Court says the government's looking at ways of controlling who and what's advertised when it comes to prostitution.
Look, we're saying that those sort of restrictions are overdue and that we do want to put something in place to control that.
If the government were to ban prostitutes advertising, the only newspaper in town would lose, it tells us, as much as $100,000 a week, something the West Australians simply couldn't afford. Editor Murray went on 6WF and got all high-minded about the threat to his revenue.
I'm talking to you now because I have a particular interest in censorship and free speech issues which do impact on this. And, I mean, some people laughingly say that this hasn't got anything to do with free speech because people pay for advertising, but that's a complete abomination in terms of the real meaning of free speech.
He followed up with an editorial about
the freedom of people to pursue a state-tolerated and condoned business.
The West isn't sure whether the oldest profession is merely winked at in WA or whether it's lawful.
A legal sex industry should have the same entitlement as any other to advertise its services.
But Murray pointed out anyway that the sex ads were quarantined in the paper. Kids weren't likely to stumble over them.
We make sure that they are not in an area where people casually reading other things, like the comics page, for example, would come across those advertisements.
Fair income? Let's see. That day's paper, here's page 49.
Ah, yes. Lizzie, 19. Long, wet tongue.
Yeah, fine. Page 50.
Sex-starved housewives want to meet horny guys.
And right next to that, on page 51, the
summary of junior sport.
On another day, you'll find
Barbie, mature, busty brunette.
Alongside the games page, chess and stamp collecting, and notices about school celebrations. Perhaps the editor doesn't know his paper as well as he thought. Speaking of editors, a couple of weeks ago I suggested the Age's new head of commerce and copy, Steve Harris, had produced a makeover of the Saturday editions that was all but undetectable. But I was wrong. The change isn't merely the two-line masthead. There's a whole new look to the photo bylines. Robert Gottliebsen now appears as Uriah Heep. Ross Gittins has become all-attitudinal, trend-setting for Sean Carney, whose new look makes him look cold. Robert Wall's on footy. What is it with the folded arms? House style? Patrick Smith, he does it too. And Greg Baum, he looks apprehensive. Len Johnson's another. Maybe his trousers don't have pockets, but at least Stephen Bartholomew's was allowed to be different. And now, a little Murdochiana. First, his Sydney Telegraph and some good news. The paper's education reporter, Katrina Bykoff, is in line for a Walkley Award. The Walkleys for excellence in journalism are the most prized of the various prizes on offer to our hacks.
Katrina Bykoff's report exposing how New South Wales' two-tier education system was failing students in Western Sydney was last night nominated as one of 3 finalists in the Best News Report of the Year category.
It was a front-page screamer and hard to forget.
Class, we failed.
Bykoff, purporting to cover the Mount Druitt High School's final year exam results, reported they were
so low, they are useless for every student.
The only school in the state which did not have at least one student with a TER score above 50.
The teenagers' futures are severely limited.
There were 19 students who did not even bother applying for a TER.
The piece triggered an avalanche of complaints to the Press Council, notably from the kids' parents and the Teachers' Federation, and 2 months later the Press Council released its decision.
The Telegraph's coverage was seriously flawed.
The material contained several inaccuracies and misleading statements.
Students affected by the article were not given the opportunity, through a published letter to the editor, to express their reaction to these shortcomings.
How is it then that the Walkley judges could rate such an infamous article as worthy of a place in the final selection? The judges' comments, which read like a Telegraph editorial, strangely, asserted that
the report awoke Sydney to the tragic inequality in Sydney's West.
It led...
Note the spelling.
It led to a reappraisal of education in Western Sydney.
Absolute nonsense. As the Fairfax Herald had reported before the bike-off piece,
the state opposition called for a full-scale review of government secondary schools in the light of the 1996 results.
Purely as a matter of record, you understand, it should be noted that one of the 3 Walkley judges treating Katrina Bikoff so generously was a Mr. Col Allen. He's her editor. And the other piece of Murdochiana, this cartoon by Peter Nicholson on Monday. President Suharto as an orangutan. The allusion is to that being an endangered species, threatened by his own corrupt economy, which Nicholson drew as the fires sweeping the region. All right, but no Walkley winner. The Indonesian ambassador blasted off a letter calling the drawing
bad taste, highly irresponsible, and therefore unacceptable, in violation of the most elementary of decent behaviour and clearly unethical.
He was supported by a former Australian ambassador to Indonesia.
Madness to create such gratuitous offence to a neighbouring country which will, in time, be very much more powerful and influential economically and in other ways than Australia.
Militarily, I suppose he means. And someone wrote from Jakarta,
we would really appreciate it if you would honestly apologise for publishing such a caricature, and I hope that it won't deteriorate the Australians' good performance.
He means Paul Kelly and Greg Sherrin would never have drawn it, if they could draw. In a truly pathetic grovel, no doubt written with due regard for Murdoch's commercial relations with the Suharto regime, the Australian's editor fell to his knees.
It was not our intention to insult the President, government or people of Indonesia in the cartoon. We did not expect or want this to be the effect. The Australian sincerely regrets that this has happened.
An apology for free speech. Don't worry, it's not likely to happen again. The free speech, I mean, not the apology. Good night to you.